Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Cryptids and Critters Paranormal. I'm your host, the Dooster. Today, we're going to continue on with our reading of the nation's first serial killers, the Harps. And at the last reading, in part one, they had just arrived at Cave in the Rock, which is well out of the jurisdiction of Colonel Gerard and Ballinger's posse of regulators who were hunting them. So anyway, meanwhile, back in Danville, on April 8th, Sally Rice Harp gave birth to a daughter in her jail cell. A few days later, the three women were tried at the April term of court, but the jury returned a verdict of not guilty as to Sally and Maria, but found Susan guilty as charged, which is kind of odd because all three were tied into the same evidence. And based on that, the court reconsidered Susan's conviction and eventually overturned it. Now, following the trial, the acquitted women claimed that they were through with the murderous Harps, and they expressed a desire to return home to Knoxville. They wanted to begin life anew. Now, taking it at their word, the good citizens of Danville took up a collection of clothes and money to help them out. They were also given an old mare to help them along their way. They were escorted out of town by the jailer and sent on their way. Less than 30 miles out of Danville, the women changed directions and headed immediately toward the Green River, where they traded the old mare for a canoe and immediately started down the river. They traveled down the river for a distance into what is now Henderson County, where they were supposed to have met up with their husbands. Not finding them there, they were at a loss when a messenger told them where they could find them. They continued down the river to the notorious Cave in the Rock, a pirate's den on the Illinois side of the river, for a reunion with their husbands. Evidently, this had been prearranged long before the Harp men ever escaped jail. The Cave in the Rock is a natural opening in a limestone bluff above the Ohio River at its junction with the Saline River. The cave is about 100 feet deep with a level floor and a vertical chimney that ascends to the bluff above. It affords a wide view up and down the river. It was a natural landmark that was well known throughout the 18th century, having served as a rest stop for river travelers as they made their westward migration. Now, beginning in the 1790s and well in the 1830s, Cave in the Rock served as the home base for river pirates. The most famous among them was the notorious Samuel Mason, a Revolutionary War veteran turned river bandit. Mason was described as a man of gigantic size and possessing no conscience, who killed for profit and pleasure. To lure in unwary and weary travelers, he constructed a large sign outside the cave and proclaimed Wilson's Liquor Vault and House for entertainment. However, once inside the cave, his unwary victims were severely beaten and robbed, and if they were extremely lucky, sometimes they lived to tell about it. Mason was a vicious river pirate, plain and simple. His favorite prey was the slow-moving flatboats laden with produce bound for Natchez and New Orleans. Mason and his men often pretended to be local pilots whose job were to guide the boats through the shallow parts of the rapidly flowing and eddy-riven Ohio River. Once aboard, they would steer the boats into a shoal, where Mason's gang would then pick it clean and take the goods to market themselves. When the Harps arrived at Cave in the Rock after their escape from jail, they joined up with Mason and his pirates. Although Mason and his men were ruthless, the Harps were a little more than what they wanted to contend with. It is said that on 2 or 3 occasions, the Harps would lure an unsuspecting traveler to the top of the bluff under the premise of showing them the magnificent view of the river. And once there, they would strip them naked and throw them off the bluff to their death. These dudes were cruel. To Mason, it was his business as usual, and his reign of terror continued up and down the river. On one particular day, a heavily laden flatboat lumbered down the river, and Mason's pirates wasted no time in running it aground and boarding it. The flatboat operators fought back and ended up being killed by the pirates, with the exception of one who surrendered to them. They took him captive with intentions of selling him into slavery on the next run into Natchez. Later that evening, the pirates threw a celebration inside the cave above their good fortune, and most of them got drunk. The Harps were concerned that the lone survivor of the attack could later identify them, so they devised a fiendish plot for their deranged entertainment, as well as eliminating a witness. With the other pirates in a drunken stupor, the Harps took the survivor up to the top of the cliff, where they stripped him naked and tied him to a horse. They then blindfolded the horse and ran it off the cliff, where both horse and rider were dashed against the jagged rocks. This act was apparently too cruel even for Mason and his band of pirates to comprehend. The Harps, along with their wives and children, were asked to leave and never return. After being ejected from Cave in the Rock, the Harps made their way back to East Tennessee in May of 1799, leaving dead bodies scattered along the way. The victims included a farmer named Bradbury, a man named Hardin, Chesley Coffey's son, who was killed in July at Black Oak Bridge, William Ballard, who was cut open, filled with stones, and dumped into the Holston River. A couple of days later, the Harps came across the brothers James and Robert Brazel on a road near Brazel's Knob. After a brief altercation, Robert somehow managed to escape and ran for help. With Robert gone, the Harps savagely beat James to death and left his body on the road. When Robert returned with some neighbors, all he found was his brother's body, badly beaten, with his throat ripped out. Heading north into Kentucky, they killed another man named John Tully, who was the father of 8 children. This murder occurred around the beginning of August in what is now known as Clinton County, Kentucky. The Harps then made their way west into south central Kentucky near Marrowbone Creek, where they come upon the cabin of John Graves and his teenage son. As it was late evening, the Harps asked permission to spend the night, and their gracious host took them in. Early the next morning, more than likely before the Graves awoke, the Harps took Graves' own axe and split both their heads open with it. They then hid the bodies in an overgrown brush fence that surrounded the cabin. The bodies lay there for several days until someone noticed a large amount of buzzards and went to investigate, and then he found a grisly sight. After leaving the Graves cabin, the Harps headed in a southwesterly direction toward Logan County, Kentucky. It was here that the Harps came upon an innocent little girl playing a short distance from her home. She was brutally murdered for no reason except to satisfy their ruthless desire for blood and gore. A short time later, the Harps crossed paths with a young Negro slave on his way to the mill. He never even stood a chance. They severely beat him, dashed his brains out against a tree. The horse and a bag of grain were left untouched. He just became another innocent victim of the ruthless Harps as they left a trail of blood across the land that was already known as the Dark and Bloody Ground. Now in southern Logan County, on the trail about 8 miles from where the Adairville stands today, the Harps came across a migrating family as they camped near the Whippoorwill River. This entire family was savagely butchered as they slept. Sources indicate that this was the George Titsworth family, comprised of 2 brothers, their wives, several children, and a few black servants. During the massacre, William Titworth, George's 8-year-old son, managed to escape and ran for help. A few hours later, when the rescue party arrived, the ground was literally covered with badly mangled bodies. While some of the party remained there to bury the dead, the others formed a posse and went in search of the murderers. The exact number killed in the Titsworth massacre is not known, but is estimated by some to be between 10 and 18 victims. Several children could mean anything from 3 to half a dozen or more, and a few black servants could indicate the same vague numbers. By counting only the absolute minimum, we can easily arrive at 10 victims. Now, immediately following the massacre, the Logan County Sheriff, who was William Stewart, organized a posse of a dozen or so able-bodied men to track down and apprehend the perpetrators of this horrendous crime. Evidently, the Harps left evidence that indicated they were headed south into Robertson County, Tennessee, for Sheriff Stewart and his posse headed south for the Tennessee line. And this is getting near where I live right now. This is just a very few miles up the road from where I'm at now. While the posse was headed south, the Harps were moving northward toward Russellville, about 3 miles northeast, in a clearing near the Mud River. The Harps stopped and rested their horses. Knowing the posse would soon be hot on their trail, it was a perfect time to develop a plan of escape should the posse close in on them. It is said that this clearing was owned by Samuel Wilson and had been used 3 weeks prior for the Great Revival. The Harps had no patience for their wives or their own children. Big Harp expressed many times that the children crying would ultimately cause their capture and even threatened to kill them. On many occasions, the women and children would spend the night some distance away so the men would not hear the cries of the children. On this particular day, Sally's 4-month-old daughter was fretful, probably hungry, and she wouldn't stop crying. Afraid the posse would hear the baby, Big Harp snatched the baby from his mother's arms, and as the horrified mother watched helplessly, he swung her by her tiny ankles and bashed her little head against the trunk of a tree, shattering her skull into several pieces. He then threw her tiny body into the woods and left the area without even taking the time to bury her. That was hard to read. Continuing northward, the killing continued. Among their victims were a man named Trowbridge, who had gone for salt at Robertson's Lick. His torso hollowed out, loaded with stones, and sunk in the Highland Creek. His body was never found, and his disappearance would still be a mystery to this day, had not one of the Hart women let the facts be known at a later date. The Harps wound up in northern Kentucky, in what is now Webster County, and stopped at the cabin of Moses Stegall. Stegall was not home at the time, but the cabin was occupied by Mr. Stegall, her infant son James, and a Major William Love. Love was a surveyor who was from out of town and had come to see the Stegalls on business. It was getting dark, and was the custom at the time. The Harps, as well as Love, were invited to spend the night, and they gladly accepted. The plan was for the Hart men and Love to sleep in the loft of the cabin, and all went well until the night when Love began snoring. Unable to sleep, Big Harp silenced the snoring by burying his tomahawk in Love's skull. He then went to sleep. Early the following morning, the Harps requested that Miss Stegall cook breakfast for him, and she naturally assumed that Major Love was still asleep. She replied that it may be a long wait, as her child was sick and she'd have to tend to him before she could cook. whereby Big Harp offered to rock the child in a cradle while she prepared their breakfast. With the child in the cradle, she proceeded to cook their breakfast and was somewhat bewildered that the child had not uttered one cry the whole time. As the Harps hurriedly consumed their breakfast, Miss Stegall walked to the cradle to check on her baby and was horrified to discover that the baby's throat had been slit from ear to ear. When Miss Stegall saw this, she let out a blood-curdling scream, and rising from the breakfast table, Big Harp walked up behind her and slashed her throat as well. As if this wasn't enough, Big Harp drove the butcher knife deep into her stomach as she fell lifeless to the floor. The Harps then set fire to the cabin and crossed the yard to the barn, where they took Major Love's horse, as well as another one belonging to Stegall, before riding off down the road. Now, still attempting to avoid the posse regulators, the Harps headed south. A short distance down the road, they came across two men by the name of Gilmore and Hodgins, who were returning home from a salt lick with a winter's supply of salt, along with their dogs who had accompanied them. Pretending to be the law, the Harps accused the two men of the murders and fired the Stegall cabin and executed them on the spot. Big Harp shot Gilmore in the head, killing him instantly. Hodgins ran for his life, and Little Harp gave chase. When he caught Hodgins, he killed him with his own pistol. Both dogs were also killed, and this cruel act would later play an important role in their undoing. In the meantime, several neighbors converged on the Stegall cabin and discovered the partially burned corpses of Miss Stegall, her child, and Major Love. Examination of Miss Stegall's body revealed that the butcher knife had been plunged so deep in her that the fire from the burning cabin had not even scorched the wooden handle. A short time later, Moses Stegall returned home from a hunting trip to find his wife and child murdered and his home in ashes. They decided to organize a posse, and Stegall rode to Robertson's Lick to round up volunteers. By this time, the Harps had traveled across what is now Hopkins County and crossed the Pond River into what is now Muhlenberg County. Here they holed up for the night in a cave beneath a large overhang, and this cave later became known as Harps' House. As the posse made their way along the road, they came across the dead dogs of Gilmore and Hodgins, and on closer inspection it was noted that even the hot August sun, the dogs had not yet bloated, which indicated they had not been dead very long. Knowing they were close, several of the posse members decided to proceed silently on foot. After 3 miles and still no sign of the Harps, the posse members on foot remounted and continued to search on horseback. Had they remained hidden in the cave with their wives and children, this story may have had a different ending. It had already been discussed among the Harps that the children were an encumbrance to them and should be killed. Sally was the only one who objected. The memory of her own child being murdered by Big Harp was still fresh in her mind. Not wanting the children killed, Sally took the 2 children down by the river and hid them in a crevice in a large rock and shielded them with her body. Big Harp rode up, and as he was preparing to kill the children, fate intervened. His name was George Smith. Smith lived near the cave and just so happened to walk up at that time. As the Harps turned their attention on Smith and how they were going to kill him, the posse, consisting of Moses Stegall, John Leeper, Matthew Christian, Neville Lindsay, Cyrus McBee, William Grissom, and James Tompkins, rode in. The Harps fled in different directions, leaving the women and 2 remaining children to fend for themselves. In the confusion that followed, Smith ran and attempted to hide behind a tree. Mistaken for one of the Harps, he was shot by one of the posse. Smith later recovered from his injuries. Big Harp mounted a horse he had stolen from Steagle's residence and galloped away. Little Harp escaped into the woods on foot. In hot pursuit, Samuel Leeper raised his rifle and fired. He was either a very good marksman or he just got lucky, for the ball struck Big Harp square in the spine and severed his spinal cord. Paralyzed from the shoulders down, he instantly lost control of the reins, and the horse veered off the trail and into the woods. Unable to hang on any longer, Big Harp fell to the ground, bleeding profusely. As he lay dying on the ground, he confessed to no less than 20 murders, which probably did not include the innocent little babies that he had ruthlessly murdered. Hearing the confessions and gory details literally pushed Steagle over the edge. He took Harp's own butcher knife, and taking Harp by the hair of the head, he drew the knife across the back of Harp's head, cutting all the way to the bone. Steagle then sliced Harp's throat, and taking Harp by the ears, he wrung off his head, much in the same manner that a butcher would do to a hog. They left Big Harp's body for the buzzards on a hill that became known as Harp's Hill. They then took the severed head to the crossroads and attached it to an old oak tree for the passing world to see. This road is now known as Harp's Head Road. And even though Big Harp confessed to 20 murders, it's probably a low guess. Some estimates claim as many as 40, but God only knows how many others were murdered and their bodies never found. Sally played an important part that day in the capture and execution of Big Harp, although she did not know it at the time. Had she not come to the defense of her children, it's highly possible that the Harps could have killed the infants as planned and made their escape long before the posse arrived. As for Wiley, a.k.a. Little Harp, he escaped the posse and made it back to a cave in the rock, where he rejoined with the pirate Samuel Mason and remained there for almost 4 years. One day, Little Harp, using the alias of John Seaton, an accomplice by the name of James May, foolishly showed up in Natchez, Mississippi, with Mason's head to claim the reward money. As the head was displayed, a large crowd assembled to view the grisly sight, and oddly enough, one of those present was a survivor of one of Mason's river attacks. He recognized a man called Seaton as Little Harp and pointed out May, as well as Harp, as two of Mason's river pirates who had robbed him. Both Harp and May were arrested on robbery charges and jailed. In January 1804, Harp and May were tried by the circuit court in Greenville and found guilty of robbery. They received identical sentences: to be hung by the neck until dead, 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 with the execution set for February 8th, 1804. The public execution was carried out on that day with a large number of attendants. The bodies were left hanging overnight, and the following morning both bodies were cut down and decapitated. Little Harp's head was impaled on a pike pole and displayed along the north side of the Natchez Trace, while May's head was displayed on the west side of town as a deterrent to other outlaws. As for the Harp wives and children, they were taken to Henderson and jailed. A short time later, they were taken to Russellville to stand trial in district court. And while they were incarcerated in Russellville, Moses Steagle suddenly appeared and was determined to break the women out of jail and lynched them for their part in the murder of his wife and child. As a precaution, Sheriff Stewart hid them in a cave until Steagle finally gave up and went home. At their trial, all were eventually acquitted of all charges. Sally Rice returned to her family in Knoxville, where she later remarried and migrated west. Maria Davidson remarried and lived in Russellville, Kentucky for a while before moving back to Tennessee. It was stated that Susan Wood went back home to Tennessee and raised her daughter there, but local legend says otherwise. Supposedly, Susan and her daughter assumed new identities and lived just south of Russellville, Kentucky. So, just how many humans were actually executed by the notorious Harps? Well, if all the before mentioned murders were actually committed by the Harps, the death toll is no less than 46. It's almost impossible to be certain, as some of their victims' bodies were probably never found. Who knows how many more victims were filled with stones and sank in some body of water, never to surface again? How many more were thrown into some isolated sinkhole and never found? There is a persuasive evidence to suggest that somewhere between 28 and 40 murders were actually committed by the Harps, mostly within a time frame of just under 2 years. It's quite possible that the death toll is much higher, for who knows what other ill-fated souls were unfortunate enough as to encounter the Harps during their reign of terror and never lived to tell about it. See, this was the story of the Harps. I hope you enjoy. I don't think you could enjoy anything like that. I didn't. I didn't enjoy reading it. It's too, I don't know, it's too gross. It's too, I don't know. So anyway, like I said, we did a documentary on them a while back. It was several years ago. And I could not get into it at all. It was just too gross. They killed their own babies. I can't even comprehend that. So anyway, that's the story of the Hart brothers. If you don't mind, subscribe to my channel. Give me a like. Share it with your friends. Again, this is the Dooster, Cryptids and Critters Paranormal. We will catch you later. Have a great day, and thanks for watching.